So to get into the real crux of the presentation here, what are we talking about when we mention the shifting role of CAE in product development? Well, what we're really saying is we're moving from hardware-driven design more towards simulation-driven design. So traditional hardware-based product development methodologies are break, fix, repeat type methods where we are doing a lot of physical testing, we're doing a lot of prototyping, and it's very expensive and very time consuming. And typically CAE might fall in at the very end of the process as kind of more of a box to check. I think most of you on the call, if you're in the product development realm, might be more of a hybrid math-based product development method where we're looking at still physical testing driven design, but supported a lot more by simulation. So we are learning still from our simulations, but we are predominantly physically based. And what we all really want to get to, odds, is this kind of holy grail, is the virtual product development method where we design by simulation, we optimize by simulation, and we are continuously learning using simulation, and then finally maybe validating at the end with physical testing. Why do we want to do that? Well, simply put, it's cheaper and it's faster. So we can front load the problem solving part of the design process to the start rather than having it at the end when we've spent a lot of money prototyping and designing and basically designing off best practices. It eliminates trial and error engineering, and it reduces, again, as I said, development costs and time to market. We can reduce number of physical tests or maybe eradicate them altogether. We can eliminate unnecessary development cycles, so going round in circles where we're not really sure what's going on. And we can minimize quality issues that sometimes occur at the very end of the product development cycle once we think we've finished. So the virtual product development process still relies on having the right people in place. So this quote I always like is, it says, owning technologically advanced software is not the same thing as truly being technologically advanced. We can own all the software in the world, but if we don't have the right minds to pair it with, it's essentially useless and a black box. So this is where Fidelis gets to separate itself from the rest of the more traditional FEA suppliers in providing end-to-end virtual testing workflows. And what we need to do is understand the product development process properly, develop novel solutions to the unique engineering challenges that we face, and then importantly, package methodologies and results effectively so they can be used going forward. The rest of this presentation will be based loosely on a case study that Bill and I worked on over the last 2 or 3 years, and that was with a predominant tier 1 supplier of axles in the Detroit area, and we were tasked with developing CAE prediction methodologies for between 30 and 50 physical tests. The 2-year project was very successful. We reduced first-time quality occurrences significantly, and that allowed us to get it right first time, save millions of dollars in annual savings, and kind of put to bed this old-fashioned build, test, repeat type design strategy that was there previously. Before we go any further, it's useful to introduce the CAE Maturity Scale, or the idea of it. And what we're looking at here is a way to characterize how much faith we have in our CAE methodologies, starting at 0, where we say we just cannot simulate this at all. Level 1 might say, well, we've got some capability, but it's not really very useful. Level 2, we can sort using A to B comparisons. And then really where we're aiming to get towards is level 3, simulation predictive, but not without physical calibration or a lot of physical testing. And then 4 and 5 is where we want to be. It's predictive, confirmation testing may or may not even be required. So what were the challenges of going virtual? And with this being more of a philosophical discussion rather than technical, we thought it'd be useful to focus on our biggest non-technical challenge that we faced during our 2 or 3 years. And that was conveying trust in a virtual product development process. Typically, with traditional CAE, management might deal with the check in the box, as you will, at the end. They don't really see a huge amount of value in CAE. It's more of an afterthought. Designers might view it as kind of a nuisance where, well, you're telling me my design's not going to work, but I don't really believe the answer that you're giving. Project managers think it might be inaccurate. They've seen a lot of data and they've kind of seen the CAE and doesn't necessarily match up. And then testing engineers know it's inaccurate because they see the data every day. They just know that the CAE often does not match up with that. And there's a good reason for this. We'll take a look at it now. Traditional CAE will provide one single data point when we ask a question such as, how does this part or assembly perform? So I've got a little imaginary case study on the right-hand side here, and we're going to say, ask our CAE department, how many cycles will this differential case see before it breaks? So we run our CAE, and we say it's going to last 274,698 cycles. I can tell you now that you have more chance of winning the lottery than that being the correct answer to this question. Probably about 1 in 300,000 chance that this is the answer. In reality, of course, there's no single answer to this question. So from the lab or the field, this is more like what we see. On the right-hand side, again, I derived some physical test values of a fatigue test with the very advanced method of bashing the keyboard 6 times. But this is very representative of what we would see in real life. And of course, in real life, we have scatter from geometry, from material, forming processes, the assembly itself, and then even as far down as, well, are the testing engineers truly testing the same way every time? The answer to that is no. So we might have 6 parts here in fatigue, and we're getting results anywhere between 150,000 cycles and almost 450,000 cycles. The question is, which one of these answers is the correct answer? And the answer is all of them are, right? They all actually happened in our real components. And so now we're looking a little bit silly over in the CAE department when we gave this single answer. Typically, our end customers will want to know what percentage of parts will fail in service. Usually that's in terms of reliability and confidence. Sometimes safety critical parts cannot fail at all. So something like a turbine blade, a wing, a wheel hub, etc., might have a requirement of 1 in 10 million probability of failure. We don't have that much data. We're never, ever going to have that much data. So we use statistical tools to characterize the behavior of a population with a small data set. And so you can see that on the right here, typical Weibull analysis. Many people will be familiar with it. We've got our reliability and our confidence in our prediction. Here's an example of what we might give for a typical automotive component. We might want a 10% failure rate with a 90% confidence. And so all of a sudden, our 150,000 cycle lowest test, all of a sudden now we're moving that down to maybe 100,000, or maybe if we want a 99% failure safety rate, we might move it down to 50 or 30,000. Now our 250,000 cycle prediction is starting to look worse and worse and worse. So how do we increase confidence in our predictions? So on the left-hand side, you can see we've got a plot of specimen number with cycles. And here's our CAE prediction. It is in error at 100,000+ cycles, so our worst performing test, and even more with our reliability and confidence built in. So we have 2 options, in our opinion, to fix this problem. And this is what we came up with during the program. Number 1, we can use big data. So we can use existing historical data to qualify and then subsequently bound our analytical predictions. Secondly, we can use design of experiment type methodologies, use the power of virtual testing to assess hundreds or even thousands of different samples very quickly and very easily. So what's big data? Well, really what we're saying it is in this context is many organizations having years or even decades worth of data just stored either in the back of a cabinet or in the bottom of a server. It can be field data, it can be pseudo field data. So there we're really thinking about test track and things like that. It can be lab data, it can be all kinds of different data. And so how can we make use of this existing data in our current CAE predictions? Well, first of all, we can use it to validate our methods. And so step one in this process is still to have a method. We still have to develop a method that we think can capture the physics at least acceptably. Secondly, we use it to correlate with the existing data. And so the more data we have, the better, obviously. And then finally, if we plot this on a log-log scale, we can visualize the prediction capability of our method and demonstrate relative predictive capability. So that might look something like this. If you have a poor or non-robust CAE method, we can see that the line of perfect prediction really is the red line, and we are nowhere near it. We've got sometimes we've predicted high and we've got low historical performance. Sometimes we're predicting really low and we've got very high historical performance. At this point, we would have to go back to the drawing board and improve our methodology. But once we have an acceptable methodology, our plots will look something more like this, where now we can say, well, all of our plots, all of our historical data is falling close to this line. And this can be data from many different, let's just say we're looking at an axle assembly. It can be from many different types of axles and many different years or even decades of end customer. Our method should be able to predict all of them. One thing we should note is that we do have to go back and build models of old parts and old assemblies, which can be time consuming, but it allows us to build this confidence within our CAE predictive capability. And that's what we need to do in order to go forward with truly virtual product development. Secondly, we can use our big data even further, and now we can use it to predict, actually. So we're using Weibel again, and we're going to build some prediction bounds by developing what we call a prediction ratio, which is virtual versus historical. One would be perfect correlation. For example, if I have a 80,000 cycle prediction, but reality was 100,000 cycles, our ratio will be 0.8. We then perform a Weibel analysis on this set of ratios and derive ratio bounds per our requirements. So then we end up with something that looks like this. We've bounded our data, and we have some scale factors that we've bounded our data by. What this then allows us to do is scale our CAE predictions accordingly and derive statistically derived or driven ranges of possible outcomes. And so previously we asked, how do we increase confidence in our predictions? We account for the test scatter. That was the missing piece in the puzzle. So now, instead of having a single value, if we take our example from previously of 270,000 or whatever it was cycles, we times it by a half, we now have 137,000 cycles. So we've bounded it on the lower end, and we have 500,000+ cycles on the higher end. And all of a sudden, our prediction capability looks a lot more convincing. Now we can go to management and say, we predicted accurately. The scatter is always going to be there. We need to understand how to predict it better. We've got data-driven statistical analysis, and even more importantly, we capture in effects of physics and tolerance that we either couldn't predict or we don't want to try and predict. So let's imagine a second phase particle was the cause of a fatigue initiation. We can't predict every single possible location of a second phase particle in a component. That would be literally impossible. This methodology allows us to capture unknown physics using historical data. We've now achieved level 4 or 5 maturity in our CAE method. But what do we do if we don't have data to begin with? So we can't expect every customer of ours to have just piles and piles of data laying around for us to use. If we remember, scatters caused by geometry, material, forming processes, all the things we talked about before, how can we generate our own scatter? And we can do this by knowledge and understanding of tolerance and physics effects on the final result. And we do this by design of experiment type design. We parameterize independent variables and then run many combinations of these known possibilities to come up with enforced scatter or analytical scatter. Response surfaces can be derived and can be plotted on this data and essentially give us an infinite number of tests or test results. CAE can then, again, bound our physical test results, and more importantly, we can understand the effect of different tolerances on our parts. So perhaps we might say, well, material had a huge impact. Let's improve our tolerance with material. Or having this fillet from 3 millimeters to 4 millimeters gave us a giant range of data. And so we can decide where we want to spend our focus in our design process. The requirements for a successful DOE are that we have, again, a robust model. We cannot get away from the fact that we need robust CAE methodologies. It's no use generating data for change in parameters if they don't reflect the real world effect of those parameters. Our changing in parameters has to be based on real world physics. Finally, we might want to utilize something like a Monte Carlo simulation with DOE, and that allows us to predict the statistical likelihood of performance based on some known statistical likelihoods of data coming off the line. If we want to do this, we obviously need to know from some sort of historical data what our statistical models are for each parameter, or else we simply can't do something like a Monte Carlo simulation. At this point, we think we should be towards this 95% accuracy of CAE, and we can slowly start to build in virtual product development methods. Our time to market and wasted spend can be significantly reduced with this get it right first time design methodology. Something else to note is we can also push boundaries that simply wouldn't have been economical previously. So things like using topology and shape optimized products rather than more traditional methods. We can look at using exotic materials and novel manufacturing methods, maybe like additive, more easily explored without the hefty prototyping and physical testing costs that we would have traditionally incurred. So a couple of examples of some of the work we did, just so that you know, we did do some work here. We looked at some high pressure die cast components. High pressure die casting allows us to rapidly produce quite complex shapes. In those complex shapes, we will always have many different stress concentrators. And fatigue prediction is extremely important in things like axle components. And so we have a myriad of challenges when it comes to high pressure die casting, things like porosity, flash, ejection defects, and what we're going to focus on here, stress gradient effects. Stress gradient is always associated with stress concentrations, and we can't get away from them. Essentially, every component we have will have some stress concentrations in it, and therefore will have some stress gradients associated with those. stress gradients known to significantly affect fatigue life. And so if we ignore them, very often our fatigue predictions are very inaccurate. So we'll get low life, we'll get incorrect failure locations, and sometimes even incorrect mechanisms. There's a number of ways that we can fix this, typically special meshing, which is extremely time consuming and almost to the point where it's non-usable in a production setting. We can also purchase very expensive software that is almost designed just to deal with this problem. We didn't want to do either of those, so we developed some scripting ourselves to extract von Mises stress gradients from every node within our models. And then we use literature-based solutions to deal with the effect or the benefit of stress gradient on these nodes. What that really did is locally changed the EN curve, so the fatigue life curve for every node, and it allowed us to provide benefit where we have these stress gradients applicably. This was then packaged in a simple to use GUI, and you can see from the lower right image there, our correlation map is, if you believe it or not, very, very good compared to what we could do before. We were able to consistently match initiation location and fatigue life using this method. The second example I want to draw your attention to is predicting shaft failure. So case hardened shafts are used all the time in industry, whether we're using induction hardening like the picture on the right, or whether we're using carburizing methods. This gives us increased strength and fatigue life in our shafts. The problem is we have complex stress states associated with mating splines, and we also have added complexity because of our hardening method. So we have martensitic phase change on the surface, which gives us a hard and brittle to soft and ductile transition between the surface and the core of the shaft. So we were challenged with developing some new methodologies to deal with this in terms of both fatigue and ultimate torsion. What we ended up doing was actually casting aside our traditional FEA methods altogether and coming up with some closed form solutions to predict notoriously difficult behavior in shafts. As I mentioned before, we've got material discontinuity, we've got spline stress concentrations that are in themselves difficult to deal with, but when we've got spline rolling operations that don't necessarily match the CAD even, we essentially have now an impossible situation. Closed form solutions provided accurate and timely methods for prediction of both fatigue and fracture in these case hardened shafts. And in fact, we were able to take analysis times down from maybe hours or days to 5 minutes using some very novel mathematical based models. And you can see our correlation map there. Again, it's sanitized, but it's very, very impressive, especially compared to what we could do before. The plot on the bottom right is a load displacement curve, and not only could we match the behavior of the load displacement, we also got the failure location, the failure load and angle correct.